The bullet that killed Thomas Zachary's wife had been meant for him, and for 6 years he carried that weight like a stone in his chest, every breath a reminder that he was still drawing air while she lay cold in the ground. He had stopped being a man that spring day in 1872, when Sarah fell, transforming instead into something mechanical, going through the motions of living without ever really being alive. His ranch outside Durango, Colorado, becoming less a home and more a prison where he served out a sentence with no end date. The cattle got fed because they needed feeding. The horses got broken because that was what brought money. Thomas ate when his body demanded it and slept when exhaustion forced his eyes closed, but there was no joy in any of it, no purpose beyond the simple biological imperative to continue existing. The other ranchers in the area had stopped inviting him to town gatherings after the first year. The ladies from the church had given up bringing casseroles after the second. By year 6, Thomas Zachary was more ghost than man, haunting his own life. He was mending fence on a scorching afternoon in July 1878 when he heard the wagon approaching, the sound unusual enough that he actually looked up from his work. The dirt road that passed his property rarely saw traffic, most folks taking the main route that bypassed his spread entirely. Through the heat shimmer rising from the baked earth, he could make out a covered wagon listing badly to one side, lurching along with an uneven gait that suggested a broken wheel or axle. Thomas stood there, hammer in hand, watching with the detached curiosity of someone observing something that had nothing to do with him. The wagon would either make it past his property or it would not. Either way, it was not his concern. He turned back to his fence, driving another nail with mechanical precision. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air, followed by a woman's startled cry. Thomas looked up again to see the wagon tilted at a severe angle, the front left wheel completely sheared off, the whole rig threatening to topple. A woman was climbing down from the driver's seat, her movements careful and measured, and even from a distance he could see her shoulders set with determination rather than panic. He told himself to go back to his fence. He told himself whoever she was, she could walk to town, could flag down another traveler, could solve her own problems without his involvement. He told himself all of this while his feet carried him toward the road, his body apparently making decisions his mind had not authorized. She saw him coming and straightened, pushing back the bonnet that shaded her face. She was younger than he had expected, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair that curled rebelliously around her face despite being pinned back, and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber brown. There was dirt on her dress and sweat on her brow, but she held herself with a kind of dignity that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he could not quite place, something Eastern maybe, refined. "My wheel gave out. I was hoping to make it to Durango before dark, but it seems I have miscalculated." Thomas looked at the wagon, then at her, then back at the wagon. He should offer to help. That was what a decent human being would do. But he had stopped being decent somewhere around the time they lowered Sarah into the ground, and the words stuck in his throat. The silence stretched between them, and he saw something shift in her expression, saw her chin lift slightly. "I have money," she said. "I can pay you for your help if that is what concerns you." "It is not about money," he heard himself say, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke these days, rarely had reason to. "Then what is it about?" She was not challenging him exactly, but there was steel in those amber eyes, a refusal to be dismissed. What was it about? How did he explain that helping her meant engaging with the world again, meant being a person again, and he had worked so hard to stop being a person, because being a person meant feeling things and feeling things meant pain. "I can fix your wheel," he said instead, because apparently his mouth was just going to keep betraying him today. "I have tools in the barn." Her whole face changed, tension draining away to be replaced by relief so profound it made him uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much. My name is Julia Keene, and I am more grateful than I can express." He gave a curt nod, not offering his own name, and walked to the wagon to assess the damage. The wheel had not just come off, the axle was cracked, the wood split along a flaw that had probably been there for miles, just waiting to give way. This was not a quick fix. This was hours of work, maybe a full day. "You will need a new axle," he said. "I have lumber, I can make one." Julia came to stand beside him, peering at the damage. She smelled like lavender and dust and something else, something that might have been hope. "How long will that take?" "Most of a day, maybe longer." He looked at the sky, gauging the sun. "Too late to start now. I will begin in the morning." He saw her process this, saw the calculations running behind her eyes. She was alone, stranded at the mercy of a stranger's hospitality. He should tell her she could sleep in the house, should offer her food and water, should do all the things that civilization and basic human decency demanded. Instead, he started walking back toward his barn. "Mister," she hurried after him, "I am sorry I did not catch your name." "Thomas Zachary." "Mr. Zachary, I do not wish to impose, but might I trouble you for some water? It has been a long, hot day." He stopped walking. Of course she needed water. What kind of monster would deny a person water? Except he knew what kind. The kind who had stopped being a person 6 years ago. "There is a well behind the house," he said, gesturing. "Help yourself. There is a guest room upstairs if you need somewhere to sleep." "I could not possibly. The room is there. Use it or do not." He resumed walking toward the barn, effectively ending the conversation. He heard her footsteps retreat toward the well, and he told himself he was glad to be rid of her, glad to return to his solitude. But that night, lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, he was acutely aware that there was another person in his house for the first time in 6 years. He could hear her moving around in the guest room, the soft creak of floorboards, the sound of her preparing for bed. It made the house feel different, made it feel less like a tomb and more like a place where people actually lived. He hated it. He hated how it made his chest feel tight, how it made him remember Sunday mornings with Sarah, making breakfast together while the sun streamed through the kitchen windows. He hated how one stranger with amber eyes could make him feel anything at all. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Thomas was up before dawn, as always, going through his routines with mechanical precision. He was feeding the horses when Julia emerged from the house, her hair braided back, wearing a simpler dress than the traveling clothes from yesterday. "Good morning," she said. "I hope you do not mind, but I made coffee, and I found some eggs and bacon in your cold cellar. I made breakfast. It is the least I could do." He wanted to tell her he did not need her making breakfast, did not need her disrupting his carefully maintained numbness. Instead, he found himself following her into the house, found himself sitting at his own kitchen table while she served him food he had not asked for. It was good. It was better than good. It was the first meal in 6 years that tasted like something other than ash and obligation. "You said you were heading to Durango," he said, the words surprising him. "You have family there," Julia shook her head, sitting down across from him with her own plate. "No family. I am taking a position as a teacher. The school there wrote to me in Boston, said they needed someone educated, someone willing to come west. I thought it sounded like an adventure. You came all the way from Boston alone." He could not quite keep the disbelief from his voice. Her expression hardened slightly. I am quite capable of taking care of myself, Mr. Zachary, or I would be if my wagon were more reliable. I did not mean, he stopped, unsure what he had meant. It is dangerous for anyone alone. So I am learning. She took a sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. You live here alone. He should have expected the question, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Yes, she waited, clearly expecting more, but he offered nothing else. After a moment, she nodded and returned her attention to her breakfast. Thomas finished eating and stood. I will get started on your axle. He spent the day in his workshop, measuring and cutting and shaping wood, losing himself in the familiar rhythms of craftsmanship. This he could do. This was just work, just wood and tools and technique. It did not require him to feel anything. Except Julia kept intruding. She brought him water at midday, brought him lunch in the afternoon. She asked questions about the ranch, about Durango, about what she should expect when she got there. Her presence was like a stone in his boot, impossible to ignore no matter how much he wanted to. The school is small, he found himself telling her. Maybe 20 students on a good day. The last teacher left after 6 months, said the isolation was too much. Were you friends with the last teacher? She asked. No. The truth was, he had not even known there was a last teacher until someone mentioned it in passing at the general store. He had stopped paying attention to what happened in town. You have friends, Mr. Zachary? The question was gentle, but it cut nonetheless. No. That sounds lonely. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something in her face that made his chest ache. Sympathy, yes, but more than that. Understanding. Recognition. As if she knew something about loneliness herself. Why did you really come west, Miss Keene? He asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the sawdust on his workbench. Because everyone I knew in Boston was married or engaged, planning their futures, building their lives. And I kept waiting for mine to start, kept waiting for something to change, and one day I realized I was just going to keep waiting forever unless I made something happen myself. So when the letter came offering me the position, I took it as a sign. A sign from who? From the universe. From God. From myself. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. Does it matter? The point is, I was existing but not living, and I decided I wanted to live. Her words hit him like a physical blow, echoing too closely with thoughts he had been trying to suppress for 6 years. He turned back to his work without responding, but her words lingered in the air between them. The axle took 2 full days to complete, 2 days of Julia occupying his space, filling his house with sounds and smells and life. She cooked meals he actually tasted. She hummed while she worked, cleaning things he had not realized were dirty, mending things he had not noticed were torn. She talked to him, asked him questions, refused to let him retreat completely into his shell. On the evening of the 2nd day, as he was installing the new axle on her wagon, she came to stand beside him in the fading light. I want to thank you, she said. You have been very kind. I fixed a wagon. That is all. You did more than that. She paused, and he could feel her gathering her courage for something. Mr. Zachary, may I ask you a personal question? You can ask. He did not promise to answer. What happened to you? What made you stop living? His hands stilled on the wheel, every muscle in his body going rigid. No one had asked him that, not directly, not in 6 years. They had all tiptoed around it, offered their sympathies, and then given him space, let him bury himself in his grief. My wife died, he said, his voice flat. 6 years ago. A bullet meant for me killed her instead. And I have been trying to figure out how to live with that ever since. And have you figured it out? No. The admission cost him something, dragged the word out from somewhere deep and painful. No, I have not. Julia was quiet for a moment, and then she did something that shocked him to his core. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her palm warm against his work-roughened skin. "I think," she said softly, "that your wife would not want this for you. I think she would want you to live, really live, not just exist." He pulled his hand away as if burned, anger flaring hot and sudden in his chest. "You did not know her. You do not get to say what she would want." "You are right," Julia said, not backing down despite his tone. "I did not know her. But I know what I see when I look at you, Mr. Zachary. I see a man who is slowly dying one day at a time, and it seems like such a waste." "A waste," he laughed, the sound bitter. "I am exactly what I deserve to be. Why? Because you survived, because you are still breathing." "That was not your choice, Mr. Zachary. The only choice you have is what you do with the life you still have." He wanted to yell at her, wanted to order her off his property, wanted to retreat back into the comfortable numbness he had cultivated so carefully. But something in her words, in the fierce conviction in her eyes, cracked something open inside him. "I do not know how," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I do not know how to do anything but this. Then maybe it is time to learn." The wagon was fixed by the next morning. Thomas hitched her horses, checked every inch of the repair, made sure it was sound enough to get her safely to Durango. This was it. She would leave, and he would go back to his life, and this strange disruption would be over, except Julia did not leave right away. She stood by the wagon, looking at him with those amber eyes, and he could see her thinking, calculating, deciding something. "Come with me," she said. "What?" "Come with me to Durango, just for the day. Make sure the wagon holds, make sure I arrive safely, and maybe—" She paused. "Maybe see what the town looks like these days. When was the last time you went into Durango, Mr. Zachary?" He tried to remember and could not. Months, certainly. Maybe over a year. He had been getting his supplies delivered, avoiding any interaction he did not absolutely need. "I do not need to go to town. Maybe not, but I would feel better if you did. Please." She said the last word simply, not pleading exactly, but with a sincerity that was hard to refuse. "Consider it payment for fixing my wagon. Escort me to town, see me settled, and then we can part ways and you can return to your ranch." It was a terrible idea. Going to town meant seeing people, meant answering questions, meant being reminded of everything he had lost. But he heard himself saying yes anyway, heard himself agreeing to hitch up his own horse and ride alongside her wagon into Durango. The town had grown in the years since he had last really paid attention. There were new buildings, new businesses, more people crowding the streets. Julia drew curious looks as she navigated her wagon toward the schoolhouse, and Thomas drew even more curious ones, people clearly surprised to see him out and about. "Thomas Zachary." The voice belonged to Ben Morrison, who ran the general store. "Well, I will be damned. Thought you had turned into a hermit for good." "Just helping the new teacher get settled," Thomas said, keeping his voice neutral. "New teacher, huh?" Ben looked at Julia with interest. "Welcome to Durango, miss. I am Ben Morrison. You need anything, my store is right over there." Julia smiled warmly, climbing down from the wagon. "Julia Keene." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'm sure I will be visiting your store quite often." The schoolhouse was a simple wooden structure on the east side of town, with living quarters attached to the back. Julia explored it while Thomas unloaded her belongings, the furniture and boxes of books she had brought all the way from Boston. It was more life than he had been around in years, and it exhausted him, but it also awakened something. Watching Julia move through the schoolhouse, already planning and organizing, already thinking about the students she would teach, he felt something stir that might have been envy. She was so alive, so present, so engaged with her future. She was everything he had stopped being. "It is perfect," she said, returning to where he had stacked her boxes. It is small, but it is mine. Thank you again, Mr. Zachary, for everything." This was his cue to leave, to tip his hat and ride back to his ranch and return to his carefully maintained isolation. Instead, he found himself saying, "If you need anything else, my ranch is only 5 miles out, the one with the white barn. I will remember that." She looked at him intently, as if trying to memorize his face. "Will I see you again? I do not come to town much." "That is not what I asked." He met her eyes, saw the challenge there, saw the hope. "I do not know," he admitted. "Well," she said softly, "I hope I will. See you again, I mean." He rode back to his ranch as the sun began to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold that reminded him painfully of Julia's eyes. The house was empty again, silent again, and it felt more oppressive than it ever had before. She had only been there 3 days, but she had changed something fundamental, had reminded him what it felt like to have another person in his space, to share meals and conversation and small moments of connection. He told himself it did not matter. Told himself he would forget about her, would slip back into his routines and his numbness and his self-imposed exile. But that night, he dreamed of amber eyes and lavender and the sound of humming, and he woke with his chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with grief. The week that followed was the longest of Thomas's life. He worked himself harder than usual, trying to exhaust his body enough that his mind would stop circling back to Julia. It did not work. He kept thinking about things she had said, kept remembering the way she had looked at him with understanding rather than pity, kept hearing her words about existing versus living. On Friday, he saddled his horse with the intention of checking his fence line. Somehow he ended up in Durango instead, tying his horse outside the general store and pretending he needed supplies. "Back so soon?" Ben Morrison asked with a knowing grin. "The new teacher has been asking about you." Thomas's heart lurched. Why would she do that? "Well, maybe because you helped her out, or maybe because she is interested," Ben chuckled. "She seems like a nice lady, smart too, already got the schoolhouse organized and met with all the families. Kids start Monday." Thomas bought supplies he did not need and left the store, fully intending to ride straight home. His feet carried him toward the schoolhouse instead, and he told himself he was just checking to make sure she had settled in all right, that it was the neighborly thing to do. Julia was outside the schoolhouse, hanging a bell by the front door. She saw him approaching and her whole face lit up, a smile so genuine and delighted it made his chest constrict. "Mr. Zachary." She climbed down from the ladder, brushing her hands on her apron. "What a pleasant surprise." "I was in town, thought I would check on you." The words felt awkward, Rusty. "That is very kind. Would you like to come in? I can make coffee." He should say no. He should make his excuses and leave. But he found himself nodding, found himself following her inside, found himself sitting in one of the small student desks while she made coffee on the wood stove in her living quarters. "I start teaching on Monday," she said, bringing him a cup. "I am nervous. I have taught before, but only at a private academy in Boston. This will be different. You will do fine." He was surprised to find he meant it, that he believed in her competence. "I hope so." She sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. "The children here need a good education. They deserve someone who cares." They talked for over an hour, and Thomas was shocked by how easy it was, how natural it felt to sit with her and share coffee and conversation. She told him about her family in Boston, about her father who had been a professor and her mother who had died when Julia was young. He found himself telling her about the ranch, about the work he did, even about some of his memories of Sarah that did not hurt quite as much to voice. When he finally rose to leave, Julia walked him to the door. "Will you come again?" she asked. "Would you want me to?" "Yes." Simple, direct, honest. Yes, I would, he nodded slowly. Then maybe I will. He started coming to town every Friday. It became a routine, something he looked forward to in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. He would find excuses, invent reasons, tell himself he was just being neighborly. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He wanted to see Julia. He wanted to hear her voice and see her smile and exist in the warmth of her presence. She would tell him about her week, about the children she was teaching and the progress they were making. He would tell her about the ranch, about the horses and cattle and the endless work. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the town go by through her window. Other people noticed, of course. Small towns always noticed. There were whispers, speculations, knowing looks. Thomas ignored them all, focused only on those Friday afternoons that had become the highlight of his week. It was mid-September when everything changed. Thomas arrived for his usual visit to find Julia upset, pacing her small living quarters with agitation written across her face. What happened? He asked, concern immediate and sharp. Nothing. Everything. I am being ridiculous. She stopped pacing, pressing her hands to her face. One of my students, Michael, has been missing school. I went to see his family yesterday and they told me they are pulling him out. They need him to work, to help with the harvest. He is only 12 years old, Thomas, and he is so bright, and they are just going to end his education because they need an extra pair of hands. It was the first time she had used his given name, and hearing it from her lips did something to his heart. But more than that, he saw her pain, her frustration, her sense of helplessness, and he wanted to fix it. What if I helped them? The words were out before he had fully thought them through. Julia looked at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. What do you mean, with the harvest? What if I went and helped them finish it faster? Then Michael could come back to school. Thomas, you cannot possibly. You have your own work. I can spare a few days. And he realized it was true. He could spare the time. More than that, he wanted to spare the time, wanted to help Julia with something that mattered to her. Why would you do that? Because I am falling in love with you, he thought, the realization hitting him like a lightning strike. Because you make me want to be a better man. Because for the first time in 6 years, I want to live again. Because it is the right thing to do, he said instead. He spent the next 4 days helping Michael's family bring in their harvest, working from dawn until dusk alongside them. It was hard work, back-breaking work, but it felt good in a way that his solitary ranch work had stopped feeling years ago. This mattered to someone. This made a difference. Michael returned to school the following Monday, and the gratitude in Julia's eyes was worth every aching muscle in Thomas's body. Thank you, she said when he came to visit that Friday. Thank you does not feel like enough, but thank you. It was nothing. It was not nothing. It was kind and generous and exactly what that family needed. She reached out and took his hand, the touch sending electricity up his arm. You are a good man, Thomas Zachary. I am not, he said roughly. I have done nothing but hide from the world for 6 years. And now you are not hiding. That takes courage. He looked at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between his, and felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it existed. Julia, he said, his voice raw, I need to tell you something, all right? I think I am falling in love with you. I think I have been falling since the day your wagon broke down. And it terrifies me because I swore I would never let anyone close again, would never risk feeling that kind of loss again. But you make me want to risk it anyway. Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, her grip on his hand tightening. I am falling in love with you too. I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was too soon, that you were not ready, that I should wait. But I do not want to wait anymore. I spent too many years waiting in Boston. I want to live, Thomas, and I want to live with you." He kissed her then, pulling her close and pressing his lips to hers with 6 years of pent-up emotion behind it. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck. And for the first time since Sarah died, Thomas felt fully, completely alive. They were married in November, a simple ceremony at the church in Durango with half the town in attendance. Thomas wore a new suit and felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he had not expected, standing at the altar waiting for Julia to walk down the aisle. When she appeared in a cream-colored dress with flowers in her hair, he felt tears prick his eyes, felt gratitude and wonder and love so overwhelming it threatened to buckle his knees. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Thomas barely heard the rest, focused entirely on Julia's face, on the love shining in her amber eyes. When it came time for the vows, his voice was steady. "I promise to live," he said, the words his own addition to the traditional ceremony. "Not just exist, but truly live. With you, for us." Julia's own vows echoed his sentiment. "I promise to remind you every day that life is precious and beautiful, even when it is hard. I promise to fill our home with light and laughter. I promise to love you with everything I am." They moved into the ranch house together, Julia bringing her books and her warmth and her irrepressible spirit into spaces that had been cold and silent for too long. She continued teaching, riding into Durango 3 days a week while Thomas worked the ranch. They developed new routines, new rhythms, building a life together that honored the past while reaching toward the future. It was not always easy. There were days when grief caught Thomas unaware, when guilt rose up and threatened to drown him. On those days, Julia held him and let him feel it, did not try to fix it or minimize it, just loved him through it until he could breathe again. "Sarah would have liked you," he told Julia one night as they lay in bed, the window open to let in the cool spring air. It had been 7 months since their wedding, and he finally felt ready to share this with her. "Tell me about her," Julia said softly. So he did. He told her about Sarah's laugh and her stubbornness, about how she had insisted on learning to shoot and ride as well as any man, about how she had loved the ranch and had died defending it. Julia listened without jealousy or resentment, understanding that loving her did not mean erasing Sarah, that he could honor both the past and the present. "I think she would want you to be happy," Julia said when he finished. "I think she would be glad you found love again." "I think so too." And he meant it, felt the truth of it settle in his bones. Their first child was born in the spring of 1880, a boy they named Samuel. Thomas held his son for the first time with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the miracle of this new life, this second chance he had never expected to have. Julia smiled at him from the bed, exhausted but radiant, and he fell in love with her all over again. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, studying Samuel's tiny features. "He is ours," Julia replied, and there was such joy in her voice it made his throat tight. Parenthood brought new challenges and new joys. Samuel was colicky and demanding, and there were nights when Thomas and Julia were both so exhausted they could barely speak. But there were also moments of such piercing sweetness that Thomas felt his heart might burst. The first time Samuel smiled at him. The first time he wrapped his tiny hand around Thomas's finger. The first time he said "Papa" in his sweet, high voice. Julia continued teaching when she could, bringing Samuel with her to the schoolhouse on days when Thomas was working the far pastures. The students adored him, and Samuel grew up surrounded by books and learning, by children of all ages who treated him like a beloved pet. 2 years later, Julia was pregnant again, and this time Thomas felt more prepared, more confident. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1882, a squalling, red-faced bundle they named Rose. She had Julia's amber eyes and Thomas's dark hair, and she was beautiful in a way that made Thomas's chest ache. "Two children," Julia said, holding Rose while Samuel climbed onto the bed to peer at his new sister. "We are building quite a family." "We are building a life," Thomas corrected, kissing her temple. "A real life." The years rolled on, each one bringing new experiences and new growth. Samuel grew tall and lean, showing an early aptitude for working with horses that made Thomas proud. Rose was fierce and stubborn, refusing to be left behind or treated as delicate. They filled the ranch house with noise and laughter and occasional tears, and Thomas loved every chaotic moment of it. Julia eventually stopped teaching to focus on the children, though she never stopped being an educator at heart. She taught Samuel and Rose to read before they could barely walk, filled their heads with stories and poetry, encouraged them to question and explore and think for themselves. On Sunday afternoons, when the work was done and the children were occupied, Thomas and Julia would sit on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. These were Thomas's favorite moments, when he could simply exist beside the woman who had saved his life, who had taught him how to live again. "You ever regret it?" he asked one such afternoon when Samuel was 8 and Rose was 6. "Coming west, marrying a broken man." Julia turned to look at him, her expression serious. "You were never broken, Thomas. You were grieving, and there is a difference. But to answer your question, no, I have never regretted it for a single moment. You are the best decision I ever made." "You are mine," he said, pulling her close and kissing her hair. "You and the children, you are everything I never thought I would have again." More years passed and the children grew. Samuel turned into a capable young man who worked the ranch alongside Thomas, who had his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. Rose was a whirlwind, determined to do everything her brother could do and do it better, her fierce independence a constant source of both pride and worry. Julia's hair began to show threads of silver at the temples. Thomas found his own hair graying, his body moving a little slower than it once had. But they aged together, their love deepening with time, becoming something solid and unshakable. In 1890, 12 years after they had first met, Thomas took Julia back to the spot where her wagon had broken down. It was a warm July afternoon, much like the one when they had first encountered each other, and he had planned this surprise carefully. "Why are we stopping here?" Julia asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "Because this is where my life began again," he said simply. 12 years ago, you broke down right here, and I was too much of a fool to realize what a gift you were, but you were patient with me. You saw something in me worth saving. Thomas." Her eyes were bright with emotion. "You saved yourself, I just reminded you that you could." "No," he said firmly. "You did more than that. You loved me when I was unlovable. You brought me back to life. And I want you to know that every single day since then has been a gift. Every moment with you, every moment with our children, every sunrise and sunset and ordinary afternoon, all of it is more than I ever dreamed I would have again." Julia was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "You are going to make me cry right here in the middle of the road. Good. Cry happy tears. We have earned them." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I love you, Julia Zachary. I love the life we have built, and I am so grateful that you broke down in front of my ranch 12 years ago." "I am grateful for it, too," she whispered against his chest. "So very grateful." They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built something beautiful from pain and loss and hope. The grief of Thomas's past would always be part of him, a scar that had never fully faded. But it no longer defined him, no longer consumed him. He had learned to carry it alongside the joy, to honor both Sarah's memory and the life he had with Julia. As they climbed back into the wagon and headed home, Thomas looked at his wife and felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. He had stopped living for 6 years, had convinced himself that survival was the best he could hope for. But Julia had shown him differently. She had arrived with her broken wagon and her amber eyes and her refusal to let him disappear, and she had reminded him what living meant, not just existing but truly living. Loving and being loved, building a family, a home, a future. Taking each day as the gift it was, and filling it with purpose and connection and joy. Samuel was 17 now, nearly a man, already talking about finding his own land someday, starting his own ranch. Rose was 15, fierce and brilliant, torn between staying on the ranch she loved and exploring the wider world. Thomas saw Julia in both of them, saw her courage and determination, and refusal to settle for less than what they deserved. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, noticing his expression. "About how lucky I am. About how my life could have gone so differently if you had not broken down that day. About how I almost missed all of this because I was too stubborn and too scared to let anyone in." "But you did let me in," Julia said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "That is what matters. You chose to live again, Thomas. You chose love over fear. That took incredible courage." He thought about that as they drove home, thought about the man he had been 12 years ago, hollow and haunted and half dead. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he barely recognized. Julia had changed him, yes, but more than that, she had given him the space and safety to change himself, to become someone who could embrace life again instead of just enduring it. The ranch came into view, the white barn standing proud against the blue Colorado sky. Home. Their home, filled with years of memories and love and growth. Thomas had never thought he would feel this again, this sense of belonging, of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. That evening, after dinner was finished and the dishes were washed, the whole family gathered on the porch as the sun began its descent. Samuel was repairing a bridle, his hands moving with practiced ease. Rose was reading by lamplight, curled up in her favorite chair. Julia was mending, her needle flashing in the fading light. And Thomas simply watched them all, his heart so full it felt like it might overflow. This was what living meant. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but this. Ordinary evenings with the people you loved. The comfortable silence of family at peace. The knowledge that tomorrow would come and you would face it together. "Papa," Rose said suddenly, looking up from her book, "tell us the story again, about how you and Mama met." Thomas exchanged a glance with Julia, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. He had told this story dozens of times over the years, but it never got old. "Well," he began, settling back in his chair. "It was a hot July day in 1878, and I was mending fence, not paying attention to much of anything. I had been alone for a long time, and I had convinced myself that was how things would always be. But then I heard a wagon approaching, and when I looked up, I saw your mother for the first time." "What did you think?" Rose asked, even though she knew the answer. "I thought she was going to be trouble," Thomas admitted with a grin. "And I was absolutely right." "Thomas," Julia laughed, swatting at him playfully. "But it was the best kind of trouble," he continued. "The kind that changes everything, the kind that saves your life." He told the rest of the story, about the broken wagon and Julia's determination, about how she had refused to let him retreat into his isolation, about how she had seen something in him worth saving even when he could not see it himself. He told them about their courtship, about falling in love, about choosing to build a life together. Samuel and Rose had heard it all before, but they listened with rapt attention anyway, the way children always did when their parents told the story of how they met. It was their origin story too, after all. Without that broken wagon, without that chance encounter, they would never have existed. When the story was finished and the stars were beginning to appear overhead, Julia leaned against Thomas's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I am glad I broke down in front of your ranch," she murmured. "So am I," he replied. "So am I." The years that followed brought more changes, as years always did. Samuel met a girl named Margaret from a neighboring ranch and married her in the spring of 1893, bringing her home to the ranch with shy pride. Rose decided she wanted to be a teacher like her mother and went to Denver for training, returning 2 years later to take over the school in Durango when Julia finally retired for good. Thomas and Julia became grandparents in 1894, when Samuel and Margaret had a daughter they named Sarah. Thomas held his granddaughter with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the symbolism of it, by this new life carrying his first wife's name forward into the future. It felt like a completion of some circle he had not known needed closing, a way of honoring the past while celebrating the present. "She would be so happy," Julia said softly, watching him with their granddaughter. "Your Sarah. She would be so happy to see all of this." "I think so too," Thomas managed through his tears. They grew old together, Thomas and Julia, their love only deepening with time. His hair turned fully white. Her hands became gnarled with arthritis. They moved slower, tired more easily, but they moved together, tired together, faced everything side by side. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, Thomas took Julia into Durango for dinner at the new hotel that had opened downtown. Durango had grown considerably over the years, had become a real town with restaurants and shops and even electricity in some buildings. But the changes did not intimidate them. They had changed too, had grown and evolved together. 20 years, Julia said, raising her glass of wine. "It has gone by so fast. And so slow," Thomas added, "in the best possible way. Every day with you has been both fleeting and eternal." She laughed at his attempt at poetry. "You are getting sentimental in your old age." "I earned the right to be sentimental. I wasted 6 years being numb. I intend to spend the rest of my life feeling everything." "Then here is to feeling everything," Julia toasted. "The joy and the sorrow, the mundane and the extraordinary, all of it." They clinked glasses and drank, and Thomas looked at his wife across the table, at this woman who had wandered into his life with a broken wagon and a determination to live, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. She had taught him how to live again, had shown him that grief did not have to be a life sentence, that love could exist alongside loss, that second chances were possible if you were brave enough to reach for them. She had given him children and grandchildren, and a life so rich and full he sometimes had to pause just to take it all in. "What are you thinking?" Julia asked, studying his face. "That I love you, that I am grateful for you, that you saved my life." He reached across the table to take her hand. "That I would be lost without you." "Good thing you will never have to be without me then," she said with a smile. "I intend to be around for many more years, Thomas Zachary. You are stuck with me." "That is all I have ever wanted," he said honestly, "to be stuck with you for the rest of my life." They returned to the ranch that night, to the home they had built together over 2 decades, and fell asleep in each other's arms the way they had every night since their wedding. Thomas's last thought before sleep claimed him was that he was the luckiest man alive, that he had been given not one but 2 great loves in his lifetime, and he had learned to honor both without diminishing either. The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and eventually even a great-grandchild. Thomas and Julia settled into a peaceful old age, spending their days on the porch watching the world go by, telling stories to their grandchildren, and simply existing together in the comfortable silence of a love that had weathered decades. On a warm spring morning in 1905, Thomas woke to find Julia still sleeping beside him, her breathing deep and even. He studied her face in the early light filtering through the curtains, tracing the lines and wrinkles that mapped out their life together. She was 70 now and he was 68, and they had been together for 27 years. "I love you," he whispered, not wanting to wake her but needing to say it anyway. Her eyes opened, still that same striking amber color despite the years. "I love you too," she murmured sleepily. "Have I told you today what a good man you are? It is barely dawn. You have not had time to tell me. Well then, let me rectify that. You are a good man, Thomas Zachary, the best man I have ever known." He pulled her close, holding her against his chest, feeling her heart beat in rhythm with his own. "I was not always good, but you made me want to be better." "You were always good," she corrected gently. "You were just lost for a while, but you found your way back." They lay there together as the sun rose higher, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. There was nowhere else Thomas wanted to be, nothing else he wanted to do. This was enough. This was everything. Eventually they rose and went about their day, moving through the familiar rhythms of a life well lived. Samuel came by with his children. Rose stopped in on her way to the schoolhouse. They shared lunch on the porch, 3 generations of family gathered together, and Thomas looked around the table at all these people who existed because he had been brave enough to choose life again, to choose love again. "What are you smiling about?" Julia asked, catching his expression. "Everything," he said simply. "Absolutely everything." As the afternoon wore on and the visitors departed, Thomas and Julia found themselves alone again, sitting in their favorite porch chairs watching the sun begin its descent. "You remember what today is?" Julia asked. Thomas thought for a moment, running through dates in his mind. "It is April 15th. Is there something special about April 15th? It was 27 years ago today that my wagon broke down in front of your ranch," Julia said softly. 27 years since we met." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "How do you remember that?" "Because it was the day my life truly began. How could I forget?" He reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together the way they had done thousands of times over the years. "Mine too," he said. "My life began again that day. You gave that to me, Julia. You gave me back my life." "We gave it to each other," she corrected. "I was just existing in Boston, going through the motions. You taught me what it meant to truly love someone, to build a life with them. We saved each other, Thomas." They sat there as the sun set. 2 people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had chosen each other every day since. The grief of Thomas's past was still there, would always be there, but it had been transformed from something that consumed him into something he carried with grace. He had learned that you could honor the dead while still living fully, that love did not have to end with loss. "I would do it all again," he said into the gathering darkness. "Every moment, every choice, every hard day and beautiful day. I would choose all of it as long as it led me to you. And I would break down my wagon in front of your ranch 1,000 times over," Julia replied, squeezing his hand. "Best broken wheel I ever had." They laughed together, the sound carrying out over the ranch, over the land they had tended for decades, over the life they had built from courage and hope and love. And as the stars began to appear overhead, Thomas Zachary felt something he had not felt in the 6 years before Julia arrived, something he had been terrified he would never feel again. He felt peace. Complete, profound, unshakable peace. He had stopped living for years after Sarah died, had convinced himself that survival was the same as living, that going through the motions was enough. But then Julia had arrived with her broken wagon and her amber eyes and her fierce determination, and she had reminded him what living truly meant. It meant loving without holding back. It meant building connections and nurturing relationships. It meant taking each day as it came and filling it with purpose and joy. It meant honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. It meant choosing hope over fear, love over isolation, life over mere existence. Julia had given him all of that and more. She had been patient when he was difficult, gentle when he was hurting, steadfast when he wanted to retreat. She had seen the man he could be beneath the grief, and had loved him into becoming that man again. And now, 27 years later, sitting on this porch with her hand in his and their whole life spread out behind them like a beautiful tapestry, Thomas knew beyond any doubt that he had made the right choice. The day he had agreed to fix her wagon, the day he had allowed himself to feel again, the day he had opened his heart to the possibility of love, those had been the best decisions of his life. "Thank you," he said into the comfortable silence. "For what? For everything. For choosing me. For not giving up on me. For showing me how to live again." Julia turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "You are welcome. But Thomas, you have to know by now that I got just as much from you as you got from me. You taught me about real love, about partnership, about building something that lasts. We are even." "Then thank you for letting us be even," he said with a smile. They sat there until the night grew cool and their bones began to ache from stillness. When they finally rose to go inside, Thomas took one last look at his land, his home, his life. It was a good life, a life worth living, a life he was grateful for every single day. Inside, as they prepared for bed with the easy synchronization of people who had spent decades together, Julia hummed softly, the same tune she had hummed while cleaning his house all those years ago. Thomas listened and felt his heart swell with love. "Sing for me," he requested softly. She looked at him in surprise. "You want me to sing, please?" So she sang, her voice wavering slightly with age but still sweet, still beautiful. She sang an old hymn about grace and mercy and love that endures all things. Thomas listened with his eyes closed, committing every note to memory, adding it to the treasure trove of moments with Julia that he kept stored in his heart. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her close. "I love you more than I have words to express," he murmured against her hair. "You are my miracle, Julia, my second chance, my whole heart." "And you are mine," she whispered back. "Always and forever you are mine." They climbed into bed together, settling into their familiar positions, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. This was how they slept every night, had slept since their wedding night, and Thomas never took it for granted. Every night he got to fall asleep beside her was a gift he had never expected to receive. "Good night, my love," Julia murmured, already drifting off. "Good night," he replied, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Dream sweet dreams." As sleep began to claim him, Thomas thought about the man he had been 27 years ago, hollow and broken and convinced he would never feel anything again. If he could go back and tell that man what was coming, tell him about Julia and their children and the life they would build together, would that man have believed it? Or would he have been too mired in grief to see the possibility of hope? It did not matter, Thomas supposed. That man was gone, transformed by love and time and the sheer determination of an extraordinary woman into someone new. Someone who knew how to live, how to love, how to embrace both the joy and the sorrow that came with being fully human. The grieving cowboy had stopped living for years. But she had arrived, and he had remembered what living meant again. And what a beautiful, precious, extraordinary thing that living had turned out to be.